Hello and welcome, everybody. My name's George, and welcome to Gazelli Art House, virtual Gazelli Art House. For today's discussion, we're going to be talking about British and American abstract art in the 1960s, and that is in conjunction with our show that we've got currently on, both online and in our gallery space here in London. Which is obviously a show of abstract painting from the 1960s by British and American artists. Before we start the talk, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. If everyone could make sure that they are muted and also that their cameras are switched off, that helps us. It helps us with the quality of the streaming. You'll be able to ask questions at the end of this talk. We're going to do a Q&A. You can leave questions in what we call the chat section. So there's a bit here where you can type into the chat and you can ask us questions, and obviously we'll address those at the end of the discussion. So yeah, thanks very much for making the effort to come join us on this beautiful Friday evening. So my name's George Barker. And I'm just going to so we've done the housekeeping. In 1959, a show at the Tate Gallery in Britain was called New American Painting. Featured American abstract expressionist behemoths like Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Robert Motherwell, and Willem de Kooning, amongst others.
Grace Harding.
In 1960, a group of British abstract artists curated a show together called Situation at the Royal Society of British Artists. And this show featured Bridget Riley, Richard Smith, John Plum, Bernard Cohen, and Mark Vaux, amongst others. And the question we're going to be sort of asking, the thing we're going to be addressing is this. So we're looking at two sort of ostensibly similar cultures. And at the same time, and within the sort of parameters of abstract painting, two very different groups of artists were addressing abstraction in very different ways. What might that tell us about what was happening in Britain and America at the time? And what influences or structures around those artists supported them being icons of those eras? We're very honoured to be joined by two guest speakers that are going to help us sort of navigate through this period and talk in more detail about British and American abstract painting in the 1960s. We've got Mark Hudson, who is a multi-award-winning author, and critic and journalist. He has been chief art critic of the Telegraph and a regular contributor to The Observer, The Mail on Sunday, The Guardian, The Sunday Times, and many other publications. And from America, from New York, we've got Will Corwin, who is a sculptor and journalist. His most recent book is And Model, and he's currently editing the collected essays of Saul Ostrow. He co-curated 9th Street Club here at Gazelli Art House this past winter, which was an exhibition of abstract expressionist female painters. And he was also the curator for post-war women at the Art Students League, and that was back in November 2019. So hello, chaps. Welcome.
Hello, George.
Ellie. And so I want to start by talking to Will Corwin and get some of your perspective on what was happening in the 60s, with particular focus on abstract expressionist painters. Now, this is probably a field that many people have written and talked about. And so many of you watching at home and listening will be familiar with some of the names that we're going to talk about. But I wonder if Will could just sort of fill us in on what that scene of abstract expressionist painters was like, who they were, and what kind of things they were addressing through abstract painting.
Well, if we're talking about the 1960s, we're moving away from the first generation of abstract expressionists to the second generation, which is a whole different kind of spectrum of artists and ways of painting. So I think what's interesting is to look at 1959, the show that's at the Tate of New American Art, how that affects, how that at least not necessarily affects, but how that interests and excites and fascinates British painters and artists in London. And then what's going on actually in New York by 1959, early 60s, you have a whole new group of artists who are trying to deal with what the original abstract expressionists had created, trying to differentiate themselves or sort of ingratiate themselves with the existing institutions. You get things like color field painting and lyrical abstraction. And so there's a whole new crop. So by the early 60s, we're not talking about, there are a few that are still painting, like de Kooning, who's still wildly influential at that point, but you've got a whole new batch of artists, and you've also got a lot of women who have sort of been accepted and are making their voices heard. So I think what we're looking at is not just abstract expressionism, the original pure abstract expressionism, the action painting of the early 50s, but it's also actually, I think, almost more original, because, we can go on and talk about this later, but I think it's very interesting that the abstract expressionists, were supposedly very, very American, but in fact, a lot of them, especially hard edge abstraction painters, are really influenced by people like Mondrian and the constructivists. So it's a very heavily European influenced group of painters. You could almost argue that a lot of the British painters in London are trying to differentiate themselves from these European roots. So I don't know. That's my 2 cents for now. We can continue talking about it as we look at some of the specific painters. But some of them are some of the artists that are less well known to me, like Sandra Blow and who was the other one? Helen Peshkian were very interesting and very, very original and completely different, I think, from a lot of what the Americans were doing. So it's really interesting to look at this. I think a lot of the British painters were very, very unique and original, and a lot of the Americans are looking at, they're learning from Hans Hofmann, they're looking at Mondrian, they're obsessed with Picasso. Gorky is obviously not an American. De Kooning is not an American, but obviously they became famous in America and they made their names in America. But they are looking at the European school, and there's this obsession with Picasso and Matisse that the British don't really have as much as the Americans do, I think. So.
How interesting. So there's a point where you're talking about the American painters of that time being heavily influenced by European.
That's the whole dialogue is between New York and Paris. And Hans Hofmann, who's the teacher of Pollock and de Kooning and Pearl Fine, and not so much Frankenthaler and Hartigan, but he knows them, and he is just this figure. Mercedes Matter is another very important abstract expressionist woman painter from the 1930s and 40s. He is based his entire reputation on connections to Picasso and Matisse that are sort of tenuous, but he was certainly in Paris at the turn of the century, and he's teaching these Americans what he thinks abstraction is. And then Mondrian shows up at the end in the 1930s, and the Americans are wild about him. And so many of these hard edge painters are clearly, looking at Mondrian. And then the British take that and are very influenced by that too, I think. So anyway.
Yeah. So would you say that the show, let's to keep it sort of tight. So would you say the show, New American Painting, was something that was kind of new for British audiences at that time, despite the heavily European influences of that scene?
Yes. There's this idea of pure abstraction all over painting. What Greenberg talks about. It's also, a lot of the British comment on it. The bigness is like kind of shocking. A painting that's 10 feet high by 20 feet, long is kind of, that's kind of very, very novel idea. They talk about the spontaneity of it and the idea of what was it? Rosenberg says, it's not a picture, it's an event. It's a recording of a moment. It's a recording of an action. This kind of spontaneity and lack of planning and just being in the moment. And the idea of it being about the creation of the work, not necessarily, what the idea behind it. A lot of that is very, very novel and breaks away from traditional European painting. So of course, they're seeing a lot of new stuff too. I don't want to completely take away from it. Obviously, it was very new.
Because the idea of sort of action painting, which you've just touched on a bit there, has become, it's sort of transposed over time into this reading that they were about emotion, expressionism, right? It's all emotional, sort of poetic stuff. Pollock being the sort of archetypal drunk, poetic, emotional, human, raw sort of character artist. And what seems sort of interesting about putting the two shows side by side is you've got a complete removal of what looks like a complete removal of this emotional stuff with the British show. But I think it's sort of interesting you say about the European influences of abstract expressionism, because I think, in terms of national identity, I mean, abstract expressionist painting seems like such a strong trope of American art history. And it's specifically American and specifically New York.
Yeah, no, it is. I just think that its origins are very European. I mean, what they did was they made it their own, but you can't discount it. And I mean, you can't discount Monet and Turner either. I mean, the Impressionists are there as well. And, there are tremendous European influences. But yeah, I mean, this idea of bigness and spontaneity, of painting on the floor, of just being in the moment is very American. And I think that was a lot of friction also between the French scene and the American scene, was this idea of, and there was a lot of criticism in the British press as well of like, is this even art? If you're just pouring things on the canvas, what is that? That's not, there's no planning here. There's no thought. Yeah. So I think it was also this kind of rash disregard and irreverence for a lot of painting traditions that were, but a lot of the talk behind it tried to link it in. Greenberg is obsessed with trying to create these linkages between, the past and abstract expressionism. So while making it a novel, unique movement.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we can bring you in at this point, Mark, because we're trying to traverse these two different cultures. And there's not a lot of information about this Situation exhibition. The reason that we sort of focused on that one in particular is that it seems to, I mean, first of all, we're showing some of the artists that were in the Situation exhibition. And also it seemed apparent that there were two different approaches to abstraction and wanting to get two different things out of using abstraction to convey a message or an idea. But I'm wondering, Mark, if you can tell us a bit more about the Situation show, like in general. And
I will do that. If I could just put that in context by looking at the Tate exhibition.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Anyone who's ever talked on Zoom will know, it's hard enough talking to about 3 people we know extremely well, and lots of people you don't. So please forgive me if I just mock them, but I'll be as fluent as I can. Now, I just wanted to say that, I mean, it's to understand the impact of that the Tate exhibition on young artists and art students, you really have to look at a time when people's access to art, particularly to art from abroad, to anything, there wasn't. I mean, there were no magazines, no internet, but beyond that, the British art scene was fantastically parochial. Some might say it still is, but then it really was very little knowledge, even among people at the leading art colleges, of what was happening outside Britain. And so that went to people that might, if you're walking around the commercial galleries, you might see a bit of St. Ives abstracty, kind of landscape-based romantic abstraction. You might even see the odd New York school painting. But to walk into a large gallery with these, as Will was saying, the sheer scale must have been absolutely mind-blowing for a young artist, and this completely immersive experience in absolutely unfettered gestural abstraction. And I was talking to Alan Jones, the pop artist, who was at Horn. I think said he was doing, at the time of the the first big Pollock exhibition here at the Whitechapel, which was only 2 months before. I think it was in November, December 58. So literally weeks before the Tate exhibition. So you had suddenly, out of apparently from nowhere, this real abstract expressionist mood is building. And he said he walked into the show at the Whitechapel and said to his mate who was with him, "We should take our tutors to court for not telling us what's going on in the world. It's like everything's happening elsewhere. We're in London. We don't even know. You know, we're students. We don't know what's happening." So from that, responding to that becomes the immense challenge. Even if you're a big figurative artist like Alan Jones or David Hockney, obviously if you're an abstract painter, if you think you're an abstract painter, you've got to face that somehow. Even if you're a figurative artist, like, for example, Hockney, a couple of months before, just before the Pollock show, there was a show of Alan Davey, actually a really great Scottish, very individual abstract expressionist painter. And Hockney, before it was at the Whitechapel, this is like the spring of 58, it was at the Wakefield Art Gallery. Hockney walked in there as a kind of national health glasses, dark-haired Yorkshire art student, and saw these explosive abstract paintings by Davey, and immediately dropped his kitchen sink Northern Dower realism and just basically started doing paintings just like Alan Davies. Alan Jones thought of himself as a figurative painter, but he realized that in order to make, figurative art that would stand up in the late 20th century, you had to work through abstract expressionism. That was the challenge. So you've got to, and for his pains, he got kicked out of the Royal College of Art. The panic at the Royal, even at the Royal College of Art, the sort of turning over of the, incredibly staid tradition of people like, have you heard of these people? Well, Carroll, Waite, Ruskin, Spear, they were sort of great figures of the British art scene, sort of like in this tight kind of provincial realist thing. And suddenly you've got these young people trying to bring something new in. And about 6 of them, I think, got kicked out for their paints. So you might find it rather surprising, given that just months later, at the beginning of 1960, British artists managed to mount this large exhibition called Situation at the Federation of British Artists.
It's the Royal Society of British Artists, I think.
Yeah. So these artists in this self-curated exhibition took over this really substantial gallery with this self-curated exhibition, and there was a rule that the painting should be no smaller than 30 meters square. Probably they used feet then, or whatever that would have been, and they should make no reference to anything outside the painting. So in other words, the kind of landscape-based abstraction of the St. Ives School, Peter Lanyon, Terry Frost. What's the other guy? Patrick Heron. That's absolutely out. We don't want anything to do with anything like that. This is going to be art of now. And I think that title, Situation, is very telling. I mean, that really sounds like the 60s, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a new, compared with what we saw at the Tate, there's a really new sensibility here. And I think one of the very interesting things about the art that blew London away in 1959 at the Tate show was that actually, as Will knows better than me, it wasn't new. I mean, the paintings that everybody was thinking, this is the shock of the new, sort of some of those Rothko, Newman, Pollock, but they're 10 years old. I mean, they're from the 50s. So the young people who are coming in with Situation are a generation younger than that. And I think it's very, very interesting. If you look at those paintings in I just want to read a quote out, which you might think really sums up what we think of as the macho romanticism of abstract expressionism, which I always, going back to what we were saying, it's really like surrealism, isn't it? It's like Andre Masson exploded with dynamite on a cinematic scale. It's surrealism in blue jeans on a kind of widescreen Western scale. And I want to read out a little quote that some people might think really sums that up. The act of putting brush to canvas is an act of lyrical intuition. And in that act, in that instant, the personality and indeed the spirituality of the artist is revealed. Anyone want to guess who said that? It wasn't Harold Rosenberg or William de Kooning or Pollock. It was actually Francis Bacon. And I think if you look at them in context, there's a kind of existential sort of agitation in a lot of that kind of immediate post-war, this question of who am I? I'm going to find out who I am by doing a bloody big painting, or by sort of taking apart the human form. Like there's something in Giacometti. Oh, I don't really like Giacometti, but you can see it there, or in the late Pollock, this kind of tragic Sturm und Drang that we really think of as the sensibility of the tragic 50s after the Second World War. Because by the time we get to the situation artists, we've really moved on from that. You're not going to find much Sturm und Drang in the situation exhibition. There is a generation younger, and there's, although the guy who wrote the catalogue, one of the painters, Roger Coleman, he acknowledged, that they were drawing a lot from the New York School, for example, painting as an environmental immersive experience, painting created in its own making rather than planned or pre-sketched. There's a constant preoccupation of modern art, the painting as an object in its own right. But so they like action painting, but not too much of the action, he says, not too much of the gesture. So in a way, they're kind of like many tendencies in their generation. They're kind of in flight from that tragic expressionist, post-war expressionism, like, for example, the early pop arts. Rauschenberg and Johns are reacting against that expression, or the nouveau realism of Paris, which is reacting against art informel, the Zero group, it's taking things back to sort of concrete actuality, and with a kind of more lighter, more playful mood. And you can see, if you look at some of the paintings, which I'm going to get a couple of slides up in a minute, the painting has a lot in common with American hard edge painting, but which actually is a concept that had only been named the year before. And given the time, it's hardly likely that many of these artists had actually ever seen any. And post-painterly abstraction, it looks a lot in common with, Nolan's, people like that, and as you mentioned, the Greenbergian formalism, the kind of flat object painting. So you might think, given the strictures of British art in the 50s, in which these artists had grown up, how did they manage to get there? So I just want to bring up slide number 1, if you don't mind. So this is one of the very few views of this exhibition which really tell us what it looked like. And as you can see, there's a lot more color field painting influence in there than the kind of gestural angst of de Kooning and Pollock. Next slide, please. And actually, you might think, finally, that, maybe not the greatest on the one on the right with the circles. That's pretty, when you look at the context of Britain at the time, where the hell did they get that from? That doesn't look bad. And I just want to look at one painting. If you look through the archway, you can see a painting by a painter called Robin Denny, a sort of noted British abstract painter. And can we go to the next slide? Then we're going to see it. It's called Baby is 3, and this is that painting, which is now in the Tate collection. And I just want to look at a few micro insights into where this is quite a mature progression of 4 colors through 3 vertical panels. How it's quite, but still stands up pretty well. And I think it's interesting to note that Denny was I was talking about the generation who got kicked out of the Royal College. He'd been there about 5 years earlier. So he'd seen the previous exhibition at the Tate in 1956, which was of modern art from America, which had a whole range of stuff in it, a lot of it very kind of quirky. You know, it had Ben Shahn in it. It had, you know, other artists of that ilk, and just a handful of abstract expressionist paintings. There was all the great names were there, but just a couple of paintings each, and that had obviously made quite an impact on painters at the Royal College. I think particularly Newman, and another influence, as Will, you were saying, Mondrian. I mean, many of the attributes of those things we mentioned, hard edge, post-painterly, Greenbergian formulas, are already there. Like so much in 20th century art was already done by 1920. I mean, there's a lot of things that you might think British artists had no exposure to were already available to them through Mondrian. And another painter that always comes to mind when I look at Robert Denny's work is Joseph Albers. And there was a big shift in British art education going on at this time towards a kind of constructivist Bauhaus sensibility that was making young artists aware of constructivism of the Bauhaus. Maholy-Nagy, Albers. So those are all things that could have been feeding into this, some of the artists in this show. And one of the things that was quite interesting was that I was talking to someone today who actually saw the Situation show, and he said that people were absolutely blown away by the fact that John Plum, one of the artists, used masking tape to create his hard edges. And young artists thought, blimey, you can do that. I mean, that's how backward Britain was. The idea of using masking tape was mind-blowing to a lot of people. And the ironic thing was that many of people, but young British artists, had got their impression learned about Newman largely from small black and white reproductions in magazines. But when they actually saw the paintings, they saw that he'd actually hand-painted all his lines. He hadn't done them in masking tape at all. Anyway, I think it's interesting that some of those British artists, they did make, I think, to give them their due, they did make quite an independent breakthrough. But they haven't, if you look in comparison with the people, their kind of American rivals, their American inspirations, maybe they haven't been quite given quite the due by either critics, curators, or certainly by the art market that they might have done.
Yeah.
There's something to discuss. Anyway, thanks very much.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Mark. So it's kind of interesting what you were saying because of course we know that, I mean, I always think the really defining art movement of the 60s is pop art. And what we're talking about here is at the same time that the Situation show is happening, pop art was really brewing away there. And then
very much so.
You know, and it became a sort of the massive global movement that encompassed almost like, it was like, I get the sense that this is what we're talking about between sort of British and American painters is almost like a rivalry or a competition, right? Or something like that where you're kind of making work that reacts against something, but within the parameters of painting. And then, of course, pop art comes along and it's like a globalized aesthetic. I think the difference between the American pop artists and British pop artists, sort of both employing the same trait, copying imagery from advertising, for example, using multiple images, or making high culture from everyday low cultural things. But I'm wondering, Will, if you can talk a bit about what we're going to talk about, a bit about the sort of movement from, at that point in America, what was happening towards that movement towards pop art. Not to leave.
Well, yeah, I think one of the main motivations, I mean, one of the biggest, the sort of generative power of the pop art movement in New York or in America, was to reject this juggernaut of Abex painting. I mean, to Mark's point, the Situation show was like grassroots, was created by the artists. They curated it. They came up with the rules. I assume they hung it and they really put it together. I mean, and when you think about that, they didn't have a chance against this juggernaut of the American ABEX movement. I mean, the show that shows up at the Tate in 1959, it goes to 8 different places, right? It's promoted by the Museum of Modern Art. There's millions of dollars behind this. It's, curated by, what you'd call professional curators at the MoMA. And by the 1950s, the MoMA is an institution. It's probably the most important museum of modern art in the world at that point. And, there's money behind it. There's there's all this New York money. There's the art market that didn't really exist on such a scale. Suddenly it's the abstract expressionists who are the ones who start becoming, almost, I don't know if they become millionaires, but they suddenly become very, very rich artists, which is not ever happened before, where you have artists when Pollock dies, his widow decides to that his prices are going to become something very different from what has ever existed for a recent artist. Suddenly people are paying $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. So this idea of the show, New American Abstraction, is actually, it's like a brand. And then you can throw in this sort of weird it's not a conspiracy theory, but this idea that the CIA felt that American abstract expressionism should be promoted because it was this vehicle for freedom. And there were problems, certainly not in London, but in places like Spain, the show caused a huge stir. It was censored. And you have major American figures behind the curation, like Frank O'Hara. So this show that shows up in London is sort of very slick. It's very well financed. It's like a movie. It's like a Hollywood movie. So I think these young British artists, when they get together, and they're not all young. I mean, some of them are I'm trying to remember now. William Turnbull is born in 1922. Most of the American artists in the New American Abstraction show, though, are a different generation. They're born in 1900 to 1920. So they're people who actually experienced the Second World War. Some of them served in it. Gorky obviously was a refugee. So they're a completely different generation. They've kind of grown up with the explosion of Picasso and Braque, and they've seen Futurism, Cubism, so they know these movements. Whereas many of the British artists are born in the 30s, so they kind of remember the Second World War. Obviously, they were children, and so by the late 50s. There's just a different sensibility, of what these people have experienced. And so there's that. So we say that. So that's abstract expressionism, a completely different generation. As I said before, obsessed with French painting, with European painting. And then pop art comes along in America. And I think something very important to mention, who we haven't mentioned in terms of hard edge painting and pattern painting, is Frank Stella. And we have a whole new group. We have Rauschenberg, we have Jasper Johns, we have Stella. They come in the early 60s, and they are trying to move away from the abstract expressionists, from Pollock in particular, from de Kooning. They're trying to make a name for themselves, and they do begin to integrate, advertising. But it's for much more, I think, subversive reasons. I don't think they're just excited by the imagery. So I think that's one of the differences between the British school of pop art and the American school of pop art, is that there's a bit more of a subversive thing going on in America. The imagery is being used, the whole idea of branding and advertising, at least among the earlier artists, is being used in a philosophical way to kind of reject Hoffman, to reject a lot of the philosophies that are going on, Rosenberg and a lot of those guys. And the British, I'm not as versed. I think it's much more aesthetic. It's a fascination. It's a rejection of American abstract expressionists as well, but it's a sort of fascination with this kind of repetition of imagery. and the use of these sort of advertising images and sort of, I think there's different motivations, but they are emerging from a rejection of abstract expressionism. I think the Americans are much more antagonistic to abstract expressionism because it's so much more of it's the giant elephant in the room that you can't escape from, whereas the British, it's a foreign movement. It's less of a problem. As I think, I can't remember if it's Coleman that says it, but it's St. Ives, as Mark said, that they're really sick of. They really don't like the St. Ives kind of abstracty landscape sensibility. Whereas for Americans, it's abstract expressionism that they're rejecting. So,
yeah, interesting. Mark, I wonder if you've got some thoughts about how this sort of, these two shows express something about the sensibilities of British and American cultures, these sort of fundamental differences between what are kind of quite similar cultures. Obviously, we share a language. But differences and how that group of painters, I mean, you mentioned it before, the group of painters from the Situation show were kind of, my sort of knowledge of that linear version of history is we're kind of superseded by the British pop art guys who suddenly came along and were making work that had a kind of a more accessible excitement to them. Will mentioned something about abstract expressionism being co-opted by the government almost as a way of saying, look, this is an example of how free our nation is and how accepting we are of these sort of new ideas. What could be said about what was happening in Britain at that time?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I'm. Yeah, blimey, you put about like the whole of about several decades of British culture in the two sentences there. I mean, Britain as proverbially, Britain in the 50s is kind of tight-arsed, repressed, grey, austerity still in operation after the war. Many of these painters had to do national service. You know, Hockney was swabbing floors in Bradford Hospital. So they I mean, you said you're talking about these people that had experienced the Second World War. I mean, I think what a lot of these people had experienced was kind of small town English drabness. You know, suburbia, very limited horizons. Most artists, the pop artists, they went to art college with the expectation of becoming school teachers, because that was the only justification to going to art college rather than going out and getting a job. So they had, and then they I mean, not least, in a way, what they did was a reaction against abstract expressionism, but it was also enabled by abstract expressionism. It was kind of two things. And I think that there is a big difference between British pop and American pop, which I think British artists are very aware of. Is this thing that I think first Alan Jones again put a word in that was very, very typical of that time: tough. American painting is tough. It goes straight for the jugular. It's big. It's bold. British art is always kind of shrug because of the perceived gentility, the kind of repression of Britain. So he and a lot of other people, British artists at the time, they're trying to make a figurative art that would be as tough as a really top-notch kind of Greenbergian endorsed abstract painting. But at the same time, I think that perception of American art as kind of tough is even more pronounced in the case of pop art, because I mean, say a Warhol, a Lichtenstein, Oldenburg, they have such absolute directness and force. And one of the criticisms that's often been leveled against British pop art is that it's kind of literary, anecdotal, quite personal, autobiographical. So Hockney is painting his friends and his swim rather than sort of somehow encapsulating something brutal about consumerism and capitalism the way Warhol does without ever wanting to be political. But he's just done it in something that is incontrovertibly direct and forceful. Hockney's painting his holiday in New York. But that is, in a way, quite liberating for the British You know, a guy with blonde hair. He's as much an icon for the British as well as for the American. In a way, a more enabling one. Openly gay guy, painting about his openly gay life. Peter Blake, for example, I mean, sometimes written off as kind of a minor figure, but he said, you know, I want to make a painting. He said this to Lawrence Alloway, who, funnily enough, co-curated the Situation exhibition and is credited with coming up with the term pop art before it even appeared in America. He said, I want to do a painting that a teenage girl will enjoy just the same way she likes an Elvis record. And Alloway apparently said, oh, what a sort of pop art you mean? And according to Peter Blake, that's the origin of the term. But I think that the fact that this stuff comes along at the same time as the Beatles, I mean, that might sound a sort of rather bland generalization. But if you're talking about the way society uses art, I mean, Britain really was helped by the Beatles to establish itself as a kind of forward-looking, young, progressive. You know, we lost our empire, but hey, we gained rock and roll. We got rock and roll from America, and we turned it into something that's even more commercially successful, even more lively. It shows a classless New Britain. And I think that people like Hockney, Lake, even Alan, all these younger artists, you know, we got young, sexy, lively, uninhibited art, same as the pop. So in a way, the CIA is using abstract expressionism to tell a story about American freedom and the possibilities of capitalism. And I think Britain, in a way, you know, Harold Wilson gave the Beatles the MBE, used pop art as much as pop music as a way of projecting a new dynamic Britain.
Nice, interesting, yeah. So do you think that, so what kind of happened with this group of artists from the Situation show? I mean, why did it not quite, I suppose Bridget Riley, you know, she's sustained an incredibly successful career. But a lot of those guys from that show were just kind of, I don't know, brushed away by the pop art movement that happened next, perhaps. What kind of?
It's funny that one of the main figures in that, I'm still not too sure if he actually was in that exhibition. Richard Smith.
Yeah,
Smith, as you know, we all call him. He was a sort of crossover pop abstractionist. There's kind of elements of cigarette packets in there.
Yeah,
he didn't. I mean, he had a huge popularity for a time, and then he just kind of sort of disappeared. What was it? The other guy was Joe Tilson, another pop artist who had a kind of interaction with abstraction. But some of the pop art, I mean, Derek Bosher and Peter Blake. I mean, they're great art. Everybody loves Peter Blake, but I suppose they're not quite as. I mean, yes, it is interesting. Maybe, as I said, maybe people like Denny could be looked at again.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff.
But they didn't have that easy access, you know, availability of Hockney. I mean, nobody did. I mean, the ability to talk to everyone via television, to just create images that people could readily understand. But I mean, the critics haven't necessarily been entirely kind to him at every stage in his career. So maybe he's paid for that a bit. What do you think, Will?
I think part of the British scene, even though it was, you know, it kind of was a bit behind, and then they were rushing to catch up, and then they were rejecting sort of British, you know, drabness of the post-war period. I think one of the big issues with the Americans also was that it was this so New York centric, and there was this rigid hierarchy of critics that you read about. When you read about the New York scene, it's very much, it's like reading a soap opera. It's like sort of like these Machiavellian sort of characters who are constantly playing off each other, and they're worrying about the value of the work and who shows where. It's very similar to the New York scene and the London scene now, but it's 40, 50, 60 years ago. And I think that there's a very, very big difference there. So I think a lot of the artists in New York, you talk about like the freedom of Hockney and the idea of like, what Blake says about wanting his work to appeal to a teenage girl. I think a lot of the American artists are almost immediately appealing towards a critical institution that they want to be legitimized by. And so it's very, very academic. And I think that's both good and bad. So there's a lot of like really deep philosophy going on. On the other hand, it's kind of very prepackaged, and you get these sort of competitions, and so a lot of the art is immediately, the idea that you'd have abstract expressionism and then you'd immediately call the next group second generation abstract expressionism. You'd already create this like taxonomy of artists, and then you have everything already has a name, right? So the idea that British pop art is just kind of this, I think this blooming of like people rejecting their culture is very different from these artists who are suddenly, well, I've allied myself with hard edge painting. And when you read about the abstract expressionists, they would get into these long, almost very brutal arguments about like, why are you painting in red? It's more important to paint in blue. And why are you using, translucent colors when you should be using opaque color? There's these sort of academic arguments that are going on that I think restricted a lot of the freedom. But it did, on the other hand, create a very, very like a machine that cranked out a lot of really good art that already came with a story that could be fed right away to people. And I mean, you can take a very, a very kind of a very skeptical look at the scene and say, well, a lot of the artists were immediately creating work that they wanted to sell. And you had people like Castelli who were, taking risks, but they were also promoting certain artists they knew their collectors would buy. And the money is not as apparent, I think, in the British scene. So a lot of artists are just doing things like Hockney is just painting, his holiday in New York, and people are looking at it and getting excited by it. And he's not necessarily doing that to try and sell. So I don't know. I think that's a very big difference, is that the New York scene ends up being much more rigid, and they're much more institutionalized, and it's much more philosophical. And there's a lot more freedom in the British scene. And I think that's why you get a lot of really weird painters that exist briefly and then they move on to something else. I mean, what's his name? Like Hoyland is a very interesting painter, and he spends time in New York. He comes back to England. He kind of creates a very unique kind of abstraction, which plays with hard edge and also abstract expressionism. I think Hoyland's a very interesting painter, as well as someone like Bridget Riley, who's like very, very unique in the way that she approaches a kind of poppy sensibility directed at, color field painting. It's like extremely rigid, but she's still dealing with a lot of the ideas that are going on in abstract expressionism. So I think sometimes the British painters are a lot more unique in a way. They're not as into different schools, and they're not so quick to subdivide themselves into like, well, I'm a lyrical abstractionist, I'm a hard edge abstractionist, I'm this, I'm that. I don't know if that's what you think, but.
Well, I think another one of our distinctive cultural tropes here is, I think, that if you just hang in there and appear to be a decent person and are reasonably friendly, and you just stick in there with the establishment, you can't. For example, I mean, you mentioned John Hoyland, who actually wasn't particularly like that, but he did keep himself very visible over the whole period. And there was a kind of in the I think late 70s, 80s, there was a kind of surge of interest here in lyrical abstraction, in which many of those figures from that era came back, into very high visibility, like John Hoyland, Gillian Ayers. Was she in this? I think she was in the situation.
Yes, apparently.
And Bert Irvin, just a sort of another of those. I think he's probably too young to be in the show, but another those kind of figures who, just by staying in the scene, not kind of getting twitchy and running off to America, which a lot of people did, and just by playing the game. And Anthony Caro. I mean, Anthony Caro is in many ways a kind of sculptural equivalent of the situation painters, but, managed to turn himself into a major cultural figure. I mean, in a way, this is bland to say, but I mean, if Robin Denny had played the game a bit, maybe we would respond to sculpture more. but you could consider if he just kind of kept going and with that, he could have been like the Carol of painting. Maybe we have a problem with abstraction, but none of those people were really harmed by that. I mean, Gillian Ayres, I don't know if she's remotely known in the States. I mean, she made the national news here when she died 2 years ago, wasn't it? When I had to write a very quick appreciation in the Telegraph. So, and Howard Hodgkin, of course, a figure very much of exactly the same generation as Robin Denny, who actually wasn't at all known at that time, was really struggling to get any impact in the 60s. Then he came along and had a big surge of fame and influence in the mid-70s. And in spite of everything we say about the British not liking abstraction, hung in there as a really, significant figure, whatever you think of his work, but just as a kind of figure on the scene, right up to his death, and I think still is. So I think it's a question of how individuals play their careers, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is very interesting interplay of ways of doing things.
It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because we want to sort of simplify the world and ask simple questions that are like, well, what do these two shows tell us about how Britain and America are different from each other? But, the reality is there are ambitious British artists who have become successful by being ambitious. There are American painters who are less self-confident and they have a more like perhaps British sensibility about them and also become successful. But I'm sort of fascinated by this conversation more broadly about the differences between British and American culture because of how much we share and how much we're able to interact with our shared language, of course. And I'm curious to know, for example, if those of you who are still with us and listening, if you've got any questions that you'd like to contribute. I know we've gone on a slightly rambly chat, but if anyone out there has got any thoughts or questions about what we've been talking about, particularly the period of these two different shows, it'd be wonderful to get some questions. And if not, I can ask some if everyone's feeling a bit shy. One of the things I did want to bring up was this parallel between the Situation Show and Frieze, which was another seminal British exhibition in the late 80s that was curated by Damien Hirst. And again, Frieze was a show that was put together by artists. And it was such an iconic British cultural movement. There are kind of these sort of parallels with that show. I'm wondering, Mark, if you can talk a little bit about what the Situation Show might tell us about those sort of comparable artist-led exhibitions. Here we go. So we've got a question. Sorry, we'll come back to that one. Why do you think the choice of colour differed so much in the works from two periods? British were using brighter and more unconventional colours. It's a good question. So you're talking about the sort of darkness of the sort of expressionist movement versus the Situation Show that featured a lot of bright sort of flat colours. Got any thoughts or opinions about that? There's two different approaches to colour.
I think, I think part of it comes out of Pollock. He was so influential, and I think Pollock, Gorky, even some de Kooning, but I mean some de Kooning does approach color, but I think a lot of these artists, they were so obsessed with color in the abstract expressionist movement that they sometimes would limit themselves, and they would try to either create very sedated canvases or very bright ones. I'm trying to think specifically if I can remember like a discourse among the artists about color. I mean, Hoffman taught color theory, and his color theory comes out of Albers, Bauhaus, but also the turn of the century Parisian. I think maybe we think of abstract expressionism as being darker because of the mythology associated with the artists more than any specific. I mean, because we think of like Rothko, and he killed himself, and his later paintings were very, very dark. And he has that famous statement about, when the black replaces the red. I can't remember exactly, but I think we all think of like these dark endings and these sort of broody, angry artists, and we assume somehow that they were very dark. And we see a lot of these, monochromatic, or we see two-color paintings, and I think that we don't associate these kind of suicidal tendencies with a lot of the British artists. We don't, look at Hockney, or we don't look at British pop artists and think of them as all having met horrible, untimely deaths. And I think so. I think a lot of it is psychological. I don't know. I think we could probably find a lot of really beautiful, colorful canvases by abstract expressionist artists in America, but there's this cloud of pain and suffering and angst that the British don't have, and we tend to think of David Hockney is like a very cheerful guy, and Howard Hodgkins is creating these beautiful, India-inspired palettes. So I don't know. I would argue that it's in the eye of the beholder, not so much in the work itself. I think that the mythology around abstract expressionism is so potent that we just think of them as these angry, alcoholic, broken human beings that came to no good in the end, but they were tortured and had to make art. I mean, that's the mythology that's been promoted and continues to be promoted. We find some artists like Pearl Fine who are, not quite like that, and wasn't a heavy drinker and didn't kill herself. And a lot of them get sidelined, and we focus on the broken-hearted ones because they had a really intense life. So I don't know. That's my take.
Yeah, I think when you go into the 60s, there's a lot more kind of playful color in American art, abstraction, don't you think, Will? When they move away from the kind of tragic, self-conscious tragedy.
Yeah, they're also less. I mean, Jasper Johns is still alive. Robert Rauschenberg lived a full life. I mean, Andy Warhol died tragically, but that wasn't really his fault. And he was, he's famous for The Factory. It became. I mean, the 60s were the 60s in New York as well as in England. I mean, it was also, the 50s are much more brooding. You have the beat poets, and you have this post-war cloud. In England, it's a lot more gray and drab, and in America, it's much more tortured and pained. So I'm not sure. I think it's just also just the general sensibility about the decade itself. I think the colorful. I mean, because if you look at Frank Stella's paintings, he goes from being he goes literally from the black paintings to this sort of almost, painful amount of color, which is, all about in his sort of philosophy of the world around him. But yeah, he does embrace. They do embrace a more. I don't know if they embrace more color, but they're more open about their, the idea of using color as a vehicle of expressing some kind of maybe joy or just kind of a more positive outlook. I get the abstract expressionists were just very dark and tortured, and the pop artists obviously were not. But also second generation, we get lyrical abstractionists, people like Ronnie Landfield and Ron Davis, and even again Stella. You get people who are like working with color primarily, Helen Frankenthaler. You get a lot of artists who are using color so as a form itself, rather than creating form and then imbuing it with color. So I think there is an embracing of the use of color as a vehicle for painting, and bright color and strong color and sort of more harmonious, joyful use of color.
Yeah, maybe in Britain because of this this kind of, not exactly a crossover, but there's some kind of landscape sensibility, even long after we talked about how the St. Ives painters were sort of written off because it's landscape based, and a lot of that later lyrical abstraction, the likes of Hoyland. I think there's quite a lot of landscape in Hoyland, and that does kind of feed in kind of the color of nature in a way, in a kind of joyful, exuberant way. I don't know if I really want to go further than that with it. And also, Howard and Howard Hodgkin and Bert Irving, there is a kind of sort of timeless nature landscape sensibility. There's a kind of flood in there with this color somehow.
Yeah, good question though. A good question. Right. I've got another question here. Do you think governmental injection of funds into the arts or lack thereof affected the success of particular movements? So I guess it goes back to what we were talking about, how the abstract expressionist movement was pushed on with some wider governmental kind of agenda and support. And there was a sort of lack of that from that particular group of artists in the UK. What are your thoughts on this one, guys? Government's propping up art, using art as sort of cultural flag waving.
Well, I mean, in the United States, the government has never propped up art. It's been entirely capitalistic. So when we say that the United States government they promoted it to a certain degree. I mean, they were happy to move the art around Europe and show it, but there was already so much money behind the New York art scene, in the MoMA. And I mean, you have all these major collectors from very big families buying up this stuff. And they'd been buying Picasso they'd been buying Picasso and Matisse. And now they were buying Pollock, and you have, Peggy Guggenheim is involved in the New York scene from the very beginning. Her gallery, Art of this Century, is basically the first vehicle to show the abstract expressionists after the Ninth Street show. And then you get all the other, big banking families coming in and buying up the art and supporting the Museum of Modern Art. So there wasn't any need there wasn't that much of a need. I think the United States government was big in promoting it with propaganda and saying, this is what freedom is. Jackson Pollock is this, midway. I mean, he's from the West Coast, but he's this sort of free, jazz infused, drunken American cowboy. And this is what happens if you have free elections and you support capitalism. And not pointing out that most of these artists were probably card carrying communists from the get go, like Rothko and Gottlieb and people like that. And certainly, I think Pearl Fine was, Frankenthaler, they all were involved in sort of socialist organizations and organizing. But that wasn't the people who were handling them. That people who were handling them kind of made them very palatable to the middle class in America, as well as the big collectors. So, with America, it's always capitalism. Anyway, I think in England, actually, there was probably more government support for the arts even in the 1960s than there was in America. But I don't know. I don't know how the arts councils worked in England in the 1960s. I don't know, if you could get money to make your art, if you could go on the dole and say you were an artist.
Well, there have been a lot of grants given to artists. I think it'd be a real struggle to think of any notable people whose careers were really substantially assisted. I mean, the person who came to mind as soon as you started talking about state endorsement was Henry Moore, because around the time of your government was helping out the abstract expressionists, Henry Moore, both at home and abroad, was really endorsed as a great British artist who was promoted just in a very similar way to show a more younger progressive Britain. I'm talking about in the early 50s now, but that really did hugely help his international reputation, and also with kind of public commissions in British towns that were being rebuilt after the destruction of the war.
And America. I mean, he's everywhere in
there
America.
You go. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's masses in Canada, isn't there? Huge rooms in Toronto of Henry Moore. So that really did help. And I sort of think maybe a similar thing that, somebody would tell me that Anthony Gormley's never received a single penny of public sponsorship. But you sort of feel, in a way, he's kind of endorsed somehow by the media and by people generally as a kind of official artist. But I think that notion of the officially endorser does kind of completely kill your credibility with the kids.
Yeah.
Henry Moore's reputation has suffered in a way as much as it benefited. from that endorsement. I think.
Yeah. And I think also some other branches of pop art that, you know, now we think of them as involved in pop art, but people like Sigmar Polke, German artists who are, you know, very, you know, playing with these ideas that are in pop art they aren't entered into this sort of dialogue between the United States and England in the 1960s and 70s, partly because they're coming out of a country that is not, you know, that isn't a fully, you know, capitalist nation. And I think there is some suppression. I mean, by the 80s, you know, with the Leipzig School, you get a lot of these German artists coming on the scene, like Kiefer and Richter and all these, and Polka. But I feel like in the 70s and 60s, when some of them are making work that is just as poppy as Warhol, I feel like there isn't, you know, they aren't entered into that discussion as much. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like there is a bit of a suppression of countries that are not as, you know, that are trying, you know, we don't want to think about German pop art in the 1960s and the 70s because of maybe it's a bit too weird. Maybe it seems to be promoting, you know, too, you know, it's not as subtle. It's sort of more about, you know, changing paradigms of culture in a way that, you know, the British and American, you know, powers that be don't want the public to be aware of, you know, giant paintings of mushrooms and things like that. But I don't know. I just felt when I saw the Polka show in New York at the MoMA, maybe I think it was about 4 years ago, I was just bowled over by his you know, very poppy earlier works, and just thinking, you know, I mean, he's up there with Warhol and this sort of fascinating transgressive use of printing. He's obviously looking at people like Lichtenstein, but he's also just very, very original. And, you know, that doesn't enter into the dialogue back then. Now, I think we think of him in that context, but back then, I don't think he was in the discussion as much. But, you know, I don't know. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, that's interesting, because I was going to say that when you come to pop, it's a bit like, at one point, the whole world was only listening to English language pop, or rather they were listening to their own pop as well, but they didn't export the way that American and British music did. I know that might seem a sort of facile comparison, but maybe not. I mean, I was going to say that, I mean, Beuys, for example, didn't harm Beuys to be very, 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 very German. Mm-hmm. You know, so maybe it was the kind of the youth culture element. Polka, I mean, is an absolutely wonderful artist. Now getting his due, but maybe it was too complex for the those. You're talking about the Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah.
Thing. I mean, what a great image, but maybe slightly more complex than the Anglo-American dominance could cope with.
Yeah, he's sort of too white album. You know, I mean, that was a bit over much for a lot of Americans, and probably Brits too. Was, you know, mass drug use, you know, subversive imagery.
Have we got any more questions in here? We've got a sort of a comment really from David Stevenson. Commercial gallerists are surely important, with Robert Fraser promoting Bridget Riley and the Beatles and the Stones coming to the gallery. So yeah, Robert Fraser was very much almost like that sort of American character almost, where he is like gregarious. It's about selling stuff. I mean, you know, he was able to obviously keep his gallery afloat by engaging with the market, and has become a sort of art dealer icon as opposed to a curator icon. So yeah, I guess there were sort of British examples of that, like funding for the arts through like capitalism. I think his example is probably in isolation really to the rest of the kind of.
What about Casmin?
Casmin, good choice. Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, Casmin as well showed all these guys, the situation artists. Early on, you know, he famously was really into this hard-edged British abstraction that seemed to kind of become sort of unfashionable, barring obviously, you know, Bridget Riley and a few others. But yeah, Casmin was another example.
And didn't Marlborough have quite a big role in a kind of second situation show?
That's correct. That's right. I think by 1965 there was a second show, and it was sort of organised by Marlborough, who had a commercial perspective on what that show would be. I mean, I'd be surprised if they still had massive paintings in it, and I wonder if they got them to paint smaller so they would be easier to shift.
Well, I think one interesting thing about Frieze, as an example, rather than going on to become a sort of endless global brand like some of the big American galleries, he kind of was a tragic British public school, kind of suffered for being, in a way, kind of gayness and all that. So as an archetype of a British dealer, is a kind of tragic failure rather than the kind of juggernaut-like success of some of the American galleries he was effectively competing with.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, look, we've covered a lot there. It's been a bit of a ramble, but I thank you so much, you guys, for going on this journey with us and enlightening and educating us about this particular scene. Obviously, there's a lot to kind of cover. You always start these things thinking, let's keep it a very simple, straightforward conversation about just sort of two exhibitions, and eventually you end up talking about lots of other, broad spectrum stuff and fascinating things about culture. I mean, I'll continue to be sort of interested in how Britain and America sort of bounce off each other, feed off each other, retain sort of independent cultures, but at the same time kind of influencing each other. I do find that relationship really, really interesting. But yeah, just wanted to thank you guys very much for coming along. I don't know if if either of you have got any last words, or if you've got things you want to promote to our audience before we head off.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. Sorry we didn't have more kind of interaction, but next time, maybe in the gallery.
Yeah, exactly. Well, next time we'll do it in the gallery. It's a lot more. It's a lot more of a live experience for people. Sometimes observing these things can be a bit awkward.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could see the show. Cross Atlantic looks amazing. I loved, looking at the pictures. It's a shame that we couldn't be there in person, but no, it's been great.
Well, we'll be back into hopefully to normal operating situation, hopefully in the next few months. And when we do that, of course, Mark, you're more than welcome to come back and join us live in the gallery, and we'll have a bit more of a buzzy atmosphere, hopefully. But thank you so much for contributing. It's been a really interesting conversation. And
thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Bye, George.
All right, take care. Thanks a lot.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye, Mark.
Bye, Will.